I'm just want to hand over to Alexia Orengo Green, who is a PhD student at the History Department at USC, and she is focusing on the Holocaust and children during the Holocaust, and with this kind of special focus on children's agency on the way to Latin America. Alexia?
Thank you so much, Wolf, and welcome everyone. Today we're going to start with the panel on boarding schools, and our first presenter for today is going to be Krista Collier-Jarvis from Dalhousie University, who's going to be talking about saving the child within the Indian, representing the residential school experience. Please give a welcome.
Sorry, 1 second. I don't think it's open yet. Jason. Oh, I think I found it. I think I got it.
It's wonderful to have IT help. Wilal and Alexia for that, and thank you everyone for inviting me here. I'm a guest here, so I feel very privileged to be in this space and on this land. I originally come from Shipuktuk, Halifax, which is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. So I'm Mi'kmaq, but I'm also of mixed settler descent. So as such, I'm kind of saturated with this knowledge that I don't exist without colonization. My ancestors are the colonizers, but they're also the colonized. So I exist in this very liminal space that is constantly warring with both sides and what's happening there. So my Nugami, that's grandmother in Mi'kmaq, Mary Gladys Bernard, was a survivor of the Shubenacadie Residential School. And while I don't have firsthand experience of the school and the experience she endured, I do carry the legacy of the schools within my body and the legacy of colonization. So besides this, I also carried the legacy of hope that our past is not going to be our future. So the Shubenacadie School, we can change. There we go. The Shubenacadie Residential School, pictured here, operated between 1930 and 1967 in Nova Scotia. Because it was the only residential school in the Maritimes, it housed Indigenous children from across the region. So over 1,000 Indigenous children came quite far to attend this school. Like all residential schools in Canada, the Shubenacadie School was a government-sponsored, church-run institution. In total, there were approximately 130 of these schools across Canada, with one closing as recently as 1996. They were governed by the Indian Act, which made attendance mandatory. So approximately 150,000 Indigenous children in total were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in the schools. Conditions were, of course, despicable. The schools were overcrowded with poor sanitation, no medical care, inadequate heating, and were run by people who generally saw Indigenous children as savages. So as such, the children suffered malnourishment, physical abuse, sexual abuse, sickness, and death. The recent confirmations of unmarked graves at the former sites of these schools speaks not only to the brutality of them, but to the silencing of the children's stories and the continued control of their bodies, even in death. And while evidence of unmarked graves has not been found at the site of the former Shubenacadie School, in May 2021, the remains of 215 children were confirmed using ground-penetrating radar at the site of the former Kamloops Indian Residential School. I'm going to go through this list, and I'm going to try not to cry because it's a very long list. So since then, 93 children were confirmed on the grounds of St. Joseph's, 54 children at Fort Pelly and St. Philip's, 35 at Muskowagwan, 182 at St. Eugene's, 160 at Cupper Island, and 751 at Maryvale. And this is still going on. We're still checking the schools. So for those who did survive, by the age of 16, they were released into the world with nothing more than an elementary level education and the address to the nearest welfare office. So having spent most of their lives in the schools, the children lost families, communities, culture, and language. The residential schools were therefore sites of cultural genocide, with the explicit goal of assimilating Indigenous children into Canadian society, essentially to kill the Indian and the child. Now, many of you have probably heard this statement before. It's typically attributed to Duncan Campbell Scott. He's a Canadian Confederate poet who also served as Deputy Superintendent of the Department of Indian Affairs between 1913 and 1932. So Scott was an avid supporter of Canada's assimilation policies. However, recently his association with the phrase has been called into question. But regardless though of whether Scott uttered these exact words, he did amend the Indian Act that made attendance mandatory in the schools. He supervised the implementation of the system across Canada, and he publicly stated, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem." His poetry became a further embodiment of his assimilation ideology, championing the myth of the vanishing Indian. So for example, in his 1898 poem, The Onondaga Madonna, he referred to Indigenous people as a weird and waning race of tragic savages. So even if we can't trace exactly where or from whom the words "to kill the Indian and the child" emerged, they have come to embody the essence of the Canadian Indian residential school system. Brianne Young rightly argues that the mandate is a biopolitical tool that is paradoxical in nature, where a kind of simultaneous survival and annihilation is called into co-being. The suggestion within this mandate is, of course, that the child and the so-called Indian cannot be left to coexist in one body. They are two disparate entities that can somehow be separated, extracting one without presumably damaging the other. As you can see, I have titled this talk, Saving the Child Within the Indian. My title becomes a kind of haunting back against the residential school mandate. Instead of bringing death into discursive being here, I seek to wrestle with the impossibility of representing trauma by invoking the futurity marked by the figure of the child. So if we save the child within, we ensure the futurity of the Indian. So to do so, I'm going to look at a painting by Cree artist Kent Monkman today, and a fictional film by Mi'kmaq director Jeff Barnaby, who unfortunately, as I was writing this, did pass away at the age of 46 from cancer. So I do owe a huge debt to his contributions, and I'm sad he's not going to be making more films for us. So both Monkman and Barnaby, like myself, are intergenerational residential school survivors. These two take up the impossible and sometimes problematic task of representing very real trauma associated with the residential school experience. So Young argues that colonial memory ensures the stories of the children who entered the residential school system never fully enter into signification. And this means that they always already resist representation. So the problem therefore becomes one of representing something that is essentially unrepresentable. If we are to believe Young, the resistance to representation is part of the colonial program. So it therefore also becomes transmitted as part of intergenerational trauma. Monkman, Barnaby, and I have inherited the impossibility of representing the residential school experience. Thus, to frame my discussion today and to mitigate the gaps in current critical approaches to fictional representations of residential schools, I occasionally draw on Holocaust scholarship. There's a lot of wonderful things in there about children and agency and children's literature and what that's doing. So it helps mitigate some of these gaps. So the first time I encountered the work of Cree artist Kent Monkman was walking through the Glenbow Museum. It's a museum located in Calgary that focuses primarily on the art and history of Western Canada. Now, Monkman's exhibition, for those who may not be familiar, is called Shame and Prejudice. And it usually has an entire floor depicting his often controversial but very important and poignant work. It consists of dozens of temporary rooms set up specifically for these artworks. and each room contains 1 or 2 works. So this is where I first encountered Monkman's 2017 painting, The Scream. Monkman's painting depicts Catholic priests and nuns, as well as RCMP officers, tearing Indigenous children away from their mothers. It takes its name, of course, from Norwegian artist Edvard Munch's 1893 painting. As such, it simultaneously borrows everything signified by Munch's paintings, such as trauma, melancholy, alienation, but it also parodies everything that Munch signifies. So in this manner, by borrowing the title and signification of Munch's painting, Monkman also borrows a way to represent residential school trauma. This becomes a method of representing the unrepresentable. However, Monkman's work is also known for its satire. Many of Monkman's paintings, including this one, are named or mastered after traditional, well-known European artwork. Monkman admits, museums across the continent hold in their collections countless paintings that depict and celebrate the European settlers' expansion and so-called discovery of the North American landscape. But very few, if any, show the dispossession and removal of the first peoples from their lands. And I would add, even fewer show this latter story from the point of view of Indigenous people. So by satirizing European artwork, Monkman adds the Indigenous voice to the history not just of Turtle Island, or what we commonly call North America, but to the history of Europe more broadly. So by employing this method, Monkman is pointing out how the legacy of these works of art is built upon the silencing of Indigenous peoples. So this painting is originally 7 by 11 feet. It's quite larger than we can see here. It makes us feel small in comparison, which is how we often feel next to such enormous iniquity as the legacy of the schools. With its colorful palette, it makes us feel much too present within a moment of atrocity. The color personally makes me uncomfortable because it's at odds with what it represents. The color essentially unsettles us in the manner that decolonial praxis states we should feel. Therefore, the aesthetics are designed to embody and evoke some affect associated with the residential school experience and methods of decolonizing the viewer. When we gaze upon the scream, we thus become visitors and witnesses to Monkman's legacy as an intergenerational survivor. Like me, Monkman's Nugami survived the schools, and in fact, he dedicated this painting to her. So all gazes in and upon the scream, including ours, eventually become oriented and reoriented upon the body of a child. So for example, if you take a moment and look, you might see the 2 RCMP officers at the front, or the Indigenous mother in blue reaching out desperately. If you follow their gaze, they always reorient upon the body of a child throughout the painting. So as such, like all gazes, we are hailed into identifying with the subject that we first see. And as such, we are immediately positioned within the gaze itself. Once positioned, we follow those gazes. And therefore, we look upon the body of the child in one of 2 ways here, as the colonizer or the colonized. But either way, we still look upon the child. And it doesn't matter where we look, we can look somewhere else and it still comes back to the child's body. And oftentimes we may feel ashamed and look away. So part of this severing of the gaze comes from our inability to be hailed by the child, and part of it resides in the realization that we are essentially reifying colonialism, making us, the viewers, culpable, possibly co-conspirators in that story of colonization. Jung calls signification and display of the child's body as abject, as spectacle, as there to be seen, captive to a penetrating and colonizing gaze that goes on and on. And yet, like my colonized body, we have the power to interrupt the gaze here. We have the power to interrupt the process of interpolation by looking away. Instead of feeling shame, we can look back. So let's turn our gazes back to the distraught mothers reaching out. And we take a moment to identify with their pain, to understand what's happening here. And then when ready, we look back at the priests and the nuns and the RCMP officers, and we dismantle their hegemonic power by reversing the colonial gaze. So motion in Monkman's painting is signified in a variety of ways as well, such as the birds caught mid-flight, the priest crosses leaning away from their bodies, and the wisps of hair trailing behind their owners. But the subjects here in the scream are caught forever in this moment of time. Young refers to representations such as these as narrative fragments that belong to a historiography associated only with the deaths. And this is all we really have, just fragments of memory. So not without the problematics of representing trauma. Paintings such as The Scream carry the potential to fill some of the gaps and to give us a glimpse of the unrepresentable. In doing so, they expand historiography beyond the deaths, specifically beyond the death of the child here. So yes, I agree with Young's analysis that the association with the deaths is undeniable, and frozen narrative fragments such as this are traumatic and gut-wrenching. But these children are not vanished. These children are not dead. And in fact, because this moment here, however traumatic and gut-wrenching, is frozen in time before the children are taken away, it defies and precedes and resists the loss associated with the schools. And that's the manner that intergenerational survivors want to accomplish with these paintings. So to fully comprehend the power of Monkman's painting, though, we need to briefly compare it to another kind of representation. And these are the tiny by comparison black and white photographs. So these may look familiar to you. They're not so different from our own school experiences for those of us who didn't have firsthand experience with the residential schools. Photographs, especially those posed within classrooms, however, evoke a narrative associated with the educational program of the schools, as does our continuance to refer to them as schools, in a way that functions as congealed ideology. So what this means is that those who stage and photograph the moment control the narrative, and all signifiers within the image, desks, teachers, drab bare walls, and so on, congeal the ideology that the schools are supposedly just that, schools. Hence the reason why the images don't feel as distant from our own Canadian childhood educational experiences. As such, what we do is we layer our own educational experiences on top of these photographs. It's a way that can possibly downplay the horror of the residential school experience, but also in a way that we can't do so with Monkman's work. Unlike these photographs, Monkman's representation results in two powerful outcomes: representing the unrepresentable and representing what John Boyne, the author of The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, calls emotional truth. Additionally, the concept of the double self is one that is pervasive in Holocaust literature and can be applied here. Adrienne Kurtzer argues that even the survivor often admits that what she witnessed in the death camps was witnessed by a different self, and only that self understands. This means that even those who survive are not those who are pictured here in their tidy little desks. Therefore, there is no real witness in these photographs, and by extension, no real account of the traumatic residential school experience. Essentially, all we really have is representation. So similarly, representation in Jeff Barnaby's 2013 film, Rhyme for Young Ghouls, allows us to represent the unrepresentable. His film takes place on the fictional Red Crow Indian Reservation and follows Mi'kmaq protagonist Ayla. After her intoxicated mother runs over and kills Tyler, her little brother, the mother hangs herself. Ayla's father takes responsibility for Tyler's death, resulting in jail time. He is released 7 years later, but the priest of St. Dee's residential school tries to punish the family because he has a personal vendetta against Ayla's father. Part of said punishment is Ayla's imprisonment within St. Dee's, where we watch her stripped of her clothes and her hair, and we see her placed in a prime position for gazing here, naked and powerless in the bathtub. Ayla clearly loses agency here, and her power to partake in gazing is removed as she first looks down, and then her eyes disappear entirely from the scene. While Young argues that reciting racialized injury and practices of bodily subjection can reinscribe hegemonic reformations of domination and power that made such practices possible in the first place, I argue that Ayla resists these hegemonic reformations during the scenes that come directly after this one. In the first scene, she dreams she is walking through the forest with Tyler, who leads her to a pit full of children's bodies. And I find this next scene really difficult to look at. So this is atrocious to gaze upon, both for us and for Ayla. In this scene, Ayla is still depicted with her long hair, revealing that the physical loss of her hair does not erase the cultural embodiment that hair represents for Indigenous peoples. This is internalized for us. But also, Ayla's hair rests upon her white robe in a way that looks uncannily similar to a priest's garb, positing Ayla as the one who embodies the power of the gaze in this moment. Instead of looking upon the bodies as savages, though, she reclaims them and provides them with the possibility of resting through her witnessing. Now, because signifiers are always and already sliding along a chain of signification that is never truly fixed, this pit gives us a visual representation of the faceless, nameless residential school victims that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. Those who have recently been found using the ground penetrating radar. We can never gaze upon the actual bodies of these children, so we can only represent them. In the scene that comes after this, Ayla emerges from the school anew. But it is the specter of her little brother Tyler who opens the door to her cell and leads her out of the school. In this manner, Ayla embodies the double self, life lived for the living and life lived for the absent, for the children left in the pit, for her spectral brother, and for the very real lost little children in the unmarked graves at the sites of the former residential schools across Canada. Ayla's experience and her subject formation within the school is one that represents, and through its entrance into representation, reclaims the Mi'kmaq children, their bodies and their stories, saving the child within the Indian. For example, Ayla's little brother Tyler is not a character wholly in and of himself, partially because we're never officially introduced to him as such, but also only Ayla and the elder interact with him. He is therefore a spectral child that haunts Ayla, but in a good way. He appears at crucial moments when Ayla needs him, and as such, Tyler can be read as the child within the Indian that the residential school seeks to extract and silence and bury. The film ends, though, with Ayla sitting next to Tyler in her treehouse, seemingly content despite her experience in the school, seemingly content despite her father's return to prison, and despite the looming threat that the truant officers may come to take her away again. Despite all this, Ayla's child remains. It never perishes. Ayla never officially loses her unity and her familial and community bonds with Tyler. So in conclusion, while representations such as Monkman's painting and Barnaby's film produce meaning, they cannot fully evoke the experience themselves. So as such, they can represent the unrepresentable without necessarily asking us to stay in the schools. We visit, we witness, and like Ayla, we emerge anew. What's happening in these narratives is that the representation is not wholly divorced from the reality, but rather it implicates reality in a complex enmeshment. Young argues that individualized representations are arrested between the singular and the plural, where a part stands in for the whole. Therefore, each representation tells both an individual and a collective story about the residential school experience. While problems can arise from attempting to represent the events, the victims, and the survivors of residential schools, Kurtzer argues we need to consider narrative strategies that give readers a double meaning, similar to the double self, one that simultaneously respects our need for hope and happy endings, even as it teaches us a very different lesson about history. Similarly, Germaine Necker-de Stijl states that if representation touches our hearts, it can have an influence on all of our moral ideas, which is really what we need right now in light of recent discoveries. We need to acknowledge our implication in the legacy of the residential schools, and we need emotional truth. In light of something that is always already unrepresentable, we can't just leave it silent. Thus, I want to leave you with some wise words from Liesel, the protagonist from Marcus Zuzak's 2005 Holocaust children's novel, The Book Thief. It didn't really matter what that book was about. It was what it meant that was most important. Walaliak, thank you.
Thank you so much for that amazing presentation. We're gonna be taking questions now. We have around 15 to 20 minutes. So if anybody has any questions.
First of all, I thought that was hard to listen to, but very important, very powerful. So thank you. I also wanted to say that since Preston McBride couldn't be here today, he would have presented that Monkman painting. And I'm very sad not to see the conversation between the two of you that might have ensued. But I wanted to ask you, Why that painting? Monkman, of course, painted many different heart-wrenching representations of children being stolen by priests, by the Mounties, and by others. I'm just curious, why did you choose that particular painting?
That's an excellent question. Thank you. I mean, first, this is my very first experience with Monkman, and I wasn't expecting it. I was walking through the Glenville Museum and I turned a corner and it was right there in my face. And I probably sat down for a good hour and stared at it. So it was kind of my first experience with Monkman, and it silenced me and froze me. So it's kind of stuck with me in that respect. But also, I mentioned Edvard Munch. And what his painting signifies. And of all of Monkman's paintings that deal with, children being taken away, this one and its relationship to Edvard Munch's The Scream, I think signifies most what he's trying to convey with that emotional truth of the experience. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. On the Monkman painting, I'm curious what you make of the three, it would seem, teenage-aged kids who are fleeing. If you have some thoughts about that, I'd be interested to know them. Yeah, thank you.
I haven't thought much about them because they're not partaking in the gaze at all, right? They're that side story of survivors who didn't actually get into the schools or left the schools, and their stories, and I've read a lot of stories of ones who fled the schools and died from exposure and things like that, and that's probably the story that we're going with them fleeing. I haven't thought it through much, but I'd love to hear more if anybody has ideas.
I think this was beautifully done, and one of my first passions was photography, and I really appreciate you bringing up the layering of one's personal perspective when I think ultimately just viewing art, but especially art that is designated to tell a story. I think as as animals, it's very hard for us to ultimately be objective. I think that is a oxymoron. It's a fallacy. So yeah, what happens when we're engaging with pieces that are telling other stories or telling personal stories that we empathize with or are a part of us is well done. I think that was beautifully stated. I guess I also kind of have a point in reference to the students, oh Lord, the children running away that I think kind of ties into this concept of fire for Turtle Island and breaking away, whether it be new clans, new generations of life. And I think as much as that could be the children suffering from potential exposure and what happened there, I think it's also representative of that need to run sometimes that exists within us as people. And I think we see that with some nations who have runners, right? When things happen, or I don't know, I find that to be really interesting. But I also wanted to kind of make reference. There's a conference that I had gone to in Cree territory called Think Indigenous, and there was an elder there teaching a lot of essentially things related to pregnancy and preparing for next generations. And one of the things she brought up, though, with regards to residential school was how it broke the masculinity that resided in fatherhood for us. And I think in this painting, there's only one man and he's on the ground, and he still, as an Indigenous man, had a gaze upon his child, but physically wasn't doing anything. And those were hard words to hear from being a guest on another nation's territory, and she is now in her early 90s, and for her to come out and say that of like the residential schools also broke what fatherhood was for us, and not being able to defend both mother and child. And in Cree, you introduce yourself by saying, where your belly button was. So it was just like a really powerful moment, and I think I would also like to hear your perspective if you've thought about that one potential Indigenous father laying on the ground and where that representation is or isn't in some of these pieces.
Thank you, Keisha. And that's great job, like pointing that out, because there's such an emphasis on how mothers experienced the loss of the child and not much told about how the fathers experienced it and what that did. And I think this painting really encapsulates that downplaying of that part of the narrative. And he is, like hidden and squashed and like over here, and you don't see him, and he's underfoot of not only the priests and nuns and RCMP officers, but under the women and what they're doing in a very helpless position. Thank you for bringing that up.
Good morning. First, miigwech for the excellent presentation. I'm a big fan of Barnaby's films, and I really love the opening of Rhymes for Young Ghouls, where Ayla says, "This is what brings my people together, the art of forgetfulness." And so I wonder if you have any thoughts about what the film has to say or can say to intergenerational survivors, to youth, about the importance of remembering. And remembering as an anti-colonial act.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much amazing things happening in this film, and it's hard to focus on just one aspect. What I love about the agency of the intergenerational survivors in this film, Ayla and her friends who aren't in the schools, is how they do step up regardless of what's happening and take control and take back things, right? Like they go right into the schools and they take what they want out of the school and they survive, right? They don't end up in this. And what I really wanted to talk about eventually with this film is the monstrosity aspect and what monstrous bodies are doing. And I think Barnaby does that in his other films as well, is kind of the layering of the monstrous body as a survival technique. And how that's going to change the story. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Good morning. Thank you for sharing this wonderful presentation with us. I have a very quick question. You mentioned the possibility of calling the schools something else. So I wondered if there was a more apt term, something that fits better. Yesterday we were talking about, not using euphemisms, naming concentration camps for what they were, naming expulsions, not removal. So I'm wondering if there's any discussion about calling the schools. Residential schools are in the news. Of course, people want to raise awareness. But is repeating that term over and over again sort of living, perpetuating the euphemism that hides the violence?
Absolutely. And I don't think you can, personally, I don't think there's a renaming tactic, because part of that hiding of trauma within education is not just part of residential schools, right? Education in general, we're all part of it. We understand what kind of colonial programs are wrapped up in it. So I think when you change that term, you're also rewriting the history of trauma associated with education rooted in Europe, right? So I don't have a proposal for a different word, and I think it's dangerous and problematic to change. I think it's really important to bring awareness to what we hide behind that term and what we push as something different. It's a really good point.
Thank you very much. And just going to this, that is about education, is there any form of representation as well of new forms of how this education has brought to not only residential schools, but all other forms of I'm thinking of the dichotomy of some people in other countries that are split, where the parents would try to hide the kids not to go to education, and the kids themselves wanted to be educated in a certain way because they wanted to belong. But at the same time, after doing the experience, they knew exactly what their parents knew that they were going to expect. But is there any form of representation of that as well in the discussion of those schools?
There's no alternative options that come up in these stories. And I mean, the Indian Act mandated it, so the indigenous communities didn't have a choice. It was pushed as, you know, this is a way of educating your child. That's what we're doing. And a lot of communities and parents didn't know what was actually happening until it was too late. It was a silenced part of the narrative. So none of them nothing that I've encountered deal with those alternatives or other forms of education that could come up. But I'd be open to hear if anyone has encountered something to put in conversation with this. But I think part of that comes from no agency and no choice. And we had a wonderful conversation yesterday about, you know, how it's being advertised as education, and how it's being pushed as something better for you. And I think it came up quite a bit in last night's conversation about language as well. So these are kind of thread through wonderful ideas.
I was gonna add though, and I think that's an interesting point, or another narrative that I think for residential schools, yeah, I don't think anyone wanted to go. However, I think we see that now when it comes to college, depending on, or even for some people graduating high school. I think from a lot of Indigenous people that can be viewed as a victory, but you do have those pockets of traumatized people where it's not viewed as a victory. And there might be elders that are like, why are you going to college? Stay home, be a part of the land. I think that gets experienced in the North sometimes too, because of the subsistence living still being at the root of a lot of things, and education is still at odds with that in many ways, or having to leave communities to go to school in the city. So I think that, like, I would just add a modern spin to what you're asking, I guess. I think we do see it, but in a different form of academia now, because there are choices.
Thank you so much. I want to follow up on this point. So just for me being ignorant, so the painting also represents the enforcement of the mandate. Is this right? Because when I did my study on the discrimination against the Aymara and Quechua in Bolivia, there was a similar problem. There was the idea of assimilation through education, and but there was really a part where the Aymara and Quechua created hidden schools, occult schools for themselves, and would try to prevent their children to go to public schools. But the state had not the means to enforce the idea of assimilation there. So that enabled practically these occult schools. So I'm wondering, probably the situation is very different in Canada.
Yeah, there was not a lot of, unfortunately, resistance in the community because it was pitched as something that was good for them. So, you know, children whose agency often gets overlooked were saying things, and their parents and communities were ignoring them. So as a result, you didn't really have those pockets of resistance or alternative underground schools that came up to educate children in their Indigenous cultures and languages, unfortunately.
I have just kind of 3 small points, and they are not entirely related. Well, the first one, probably obvious, the scene with the mass grave, which is just so haunting. It is an evocation of kind of very familiar Holocaust imaginary, because again, in relation to those graves that were discovered by ground penetrating radar, obviously this is not the imagery. So again, because maybe, you know, I work on kind of comparing or sort of intersections of the Holocaust and how the interpolation of the Holocaust is being appropriated to make a claim to historical justice for Indigenous survivors. I just find that kind of visual reference really powerful, and I still don't quite know what it's doing, right? But it is a very powerful, again, interpolation of, you know, a different genocide that is so familiar and has been like so powerfully reiterated in popular imagination, right? To say, and this happened, and it remains invisible. So I just wanted to kind of draw attention to, again, that kind of visual referencing of the Holocaust yet again, and then going beyond it. The second one is what Ben was asking, why scream? And how to put it, for me, this image, and maybe I'm still thinking about what we were saying about languages being taken away. How do you visualize the voice being taken away? And for me, this painting does that, right? It conveys the voice that was silent. And I'm thinking, who is screaming in this painting? I don't quite know, because we are also screaming in response to it. But I think it's just such a powerful visualization of the silencing of the voice and also releasing of the voice, you know, like it releases the voice that was silent. So that's I think why this painting is so powerful. It like reimagines the voice. And the third one, not how to put it, but you yourself, Krista, introduced me to some of like the most amazing fictional works by Indigenous writers today. And at least in Canada, this is probably the most kind of powerful literature being written today, and also art, etc. So I just kind of, I think about it as, I don't know, like sovereign imagination, because what we saw were works of imagination, right? And how it kind of reworks the past and kind of in a way reclaims sovereignty by exercising this like imaginative potential in such a powerful way. So again, for me, this is just such a powerful political statement. So unrelated comments, but it's a lot.
Thank you, Dorita. I think of the kind of the fictional aspect as storytelling. It's Indigenous storytelling, right? Like it doesn't have to be fact for it to be meaningful or to teach us anything. But thank you for bringing up the comparative part of the picture, the still image from the movie, because it reminded me when I saw it of standing in Treblinka on the edge of the mass grave. It's the one part I couldn't photograph when I was there, but it puts you in that position. So it's hard to ignore any genocide, because that's something that happened to so many people.
Yes, one example coming from far away. The words matters, because when the words exist, it allows the question. For example, in Argentina today, the case of the residential schools in Canada is very important, because today prosecutors in trial ask historians what happened with the residential schools in Patagonia, for example, and well, concentration camps too, and the importance that your work and the case of that you have been studying is reflected in different ways around the world, and the words matter.
Absolutely, and putting them into conversation does. I really appreciate the brief talk you had the other day about schools in Argentina, because I noticed the parallels there. And I think that's why it's really important that we're here and having conversations back and forth to see what we can learn from the different experiences. So thank you.
Thank you.
That's